outside the United Nations General Assembly Hall. We are building up to that speech for tomorrow where S. Jaishankar will take to the podium and push India's agenda on the global stage. Joining me to discuss all of the things leading up to that and more is Shombi Sharp. He is the United Nations resident coordinator in India. Thank you very much for joining us, Shombi. Pleasure. Let's first get into everything. Of course, Jaishankar is expected to bring up many topics, of course. What is your thoughts on his agenda at the United Nations? Of course, India on the global stage. What are your thoughts on how he has been putting himself forward? Pre that, of course, we have seen a push for counter-terrorism that has been a vocal point of where and what India is standing for. Can I just get your thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. Always a pleasure to speak to NewsX. Mujhe yahan bulane ke liye dhanyavad. It's really, first of all, on behalf of the UN in India, it's a real honor to be here in New York. I think we've felt incredible energy this week, and it just reminds you when you're here at the UN and you see all of the world's peoples together in one place, all of the languages and everything, you're really reminded about why it's so vitally important that we have this place, this space, where the world can come together and every country's concerns and ideas are heard. So I think, and that cuts very much to, of course, I don't know what the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, will say, but if we look at his remarks at the G20 foreign ministers conversation, and if we look at India's priorities, generally speaking, I think that very much resonates with the important leadership role of India in terms of being a voice for the Global South, really putting the Global South issues at the very center of the highest level geopolitical discourse. We saw the G20 presidency of India and Dr. Jaishankar's remarks that, the Global South, developing countries, are the countries that did not create the problems that we're facing collectively today, whether it's climate change, whether it's the raging conflicts around, a debt crisis, and yet they are paying the highest price for that across the board. And so India is advocating for a balanced approach, advocating to understand that we cannot have peace without development, and we cannot have development without peace. So the world needs to come together and live up to its commitments, its obligations, to work with the Global South, to provide technology transfer, to provide financing, to help accelerate the energy transition, for example. And that's why Dr. Jaishankar said that we need more international collaboration, more dialogue, more diplomacy, not less. And even though we are at a milestone year, it's the 80th anniversary of the UN, in a way we should be celebrating the very concept of coming together to develop collective solutions to common challenges. We see that some actors in the geopolitical space are pulling away from the global commons at this very moment in time. So I think his was a clarion call to refocus energies and say, no, we have to work together. Of course, we have to always improve and change and adapt and reform the way that we do. There's no doubt that multilateralism, the UN included, is not updated to the world as it is today. It was founded, sort of by our grandparents. We can't expect that institution to deliver for our grandchildren. So we need reform. Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is the leading proponent for reform, and that's at all levels. And we have a number of different initiatives underway. I think you mentioned, for example, counterterrorism and the intersection between terrorism and technology and digital space. And this is where the UN and India, with India's leadership, are working very, very closely together. UN Secretary General, his first priority coming into office was to strengthen the office of counterterrorism office within the UN. India, when it was leading the Security Council, really took charge of the counterterrorism committee, brought them to India, brought them to Mumbai, to Delhi, and launched the New Delhi Declaration, which was about ensuring that the fight against terrorism takes advantage of the latest technological advances of AI and is able to prevent financing for terrorism as well. So all of these points, I think, will probably come together, one could assume. But most importantly, or perhaps as important, is the fact that because the world has changed, the voice of India, which has always been important, it's a thousands of years old civilization, is incredibly important today. We need the kind of solutions, the kind of thinking, and the kind of unity that India brings together in the world.
Yes, indeed, and of course you speak of the theme of 80 years and the need for another 80 years of the United Nations. What kind of work is being done, and how difficult or easy is it to reform something like this? Of course, there is calls for India to have a permanent seat on that United Nations Security Council. What are the thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, look, again, the Secretary General of the UN is the biggest proponent for reform, including of the Security Council. But this is the mandate of the member states, not of the UN itself, not of the institution. And I think one can objectively say, I mean, it's difficult to think of a country that has a stronger, resume to be a permanent member of the Security Council than India. I mean, every metric you look at, the largest country in the world, has provided the most support to UN peacekeeping since the very beginning of time. Incredible contributions to peace and security. India is, a growing space power as well. Landed on the moon not too long ago. So really, whatever dimension you look at, I think that this institution needs to catch up with the world as it is today, and reflecting India's important leadership role would be a vital element of that. So again, it's not for us in the institution to say, but I'm quite sure one cannot imagine that you wouldn't have a reformed UN in the near future with India very much there at the table, reflecting its important role.
Now, of course, Shombi, it's very easy for one to look at the geopolitics, the theatrics here at the UNGA, but of course there is so much more than that. What more work does the United Nations do in India that you find so important?
Sure. Well, I think what's really so important about the work in the UN is that the UN in India is that we have adapted our way of working. In fact, what we do now is we're working across communities and states across India. We're increasingly identifying and codifying Indian best practice and bringing that to the international stage. So we see it really as a two-way partnership through South-South cooperation. India has been, again, a big champion of South-South cooperation. And what makes it so exciting is that India has demonstrated actually doing the work, development solutions at enormous scale. So we look at food security, for example, the targeted public distribution system on the basis of rights. It's a rights basis to food security for all people in India. You look at digital public infrastructure. India has the Indian model, let's say, the Indian stack, really is world class. It's something new, I think, bringing all of these elements together, providing cheap, accessible data and internet access for everybody in rural areas and all economic strata, looking at, let's say, financial inclusion, especially for women, on the basis of digital accounts access, moving from 25% to 85%, something thereabout, women with digital bank accounts. So, and many other solutions that are very relevant for other countries, especially in the Global South, to help accelerate their development path. But not only the Global South. Also, I would stress India's amazing investments in renewable energy. We are seeing tremendous growth in terms of the renewable energy, the energy transition in India. Now I believe it's about the third largest solar producer of solar energy in the world. Electric mobility, electric vehicles are really just exploding in India, as you see. There's a green hydrogen mission. So really, India is setting a tone in terms of renewable energy for the energy transition, and that's something that's really valuable for everybody, Global South and not only.
Yes, and of course, Now let's move on. Of course, there has been a huge theme here at this entire summit, and of course it would be undeniable to say that the world is facing serious crises right now. How is the UN as a body? Of course, it has been critiqued by numerous countries during this summit, of course notably by high levels of state. And what do you make of those comments that say the UN is not a peacekeeping body anymore?
Well, first of all, I think it's always important to understand that when we say, the UN, it's not a monolith, right? So quite often the criticisms, and I mean, many of them are quite fair. I mean, we look around the world and conflicts are raging. But that is not for lack of effort on the part of the UN. The challenge is that the UN, when it comes to that, really the teeth of the institution in terms of peace and security, it requires the member states coming to a collective decision, and then that empowers the UN to act. But if you have member states disagreeing, especially the permanent members of the Security Council with different positions, then really the UN institution is blocked from action. So that is a challenge, no doubt about that. But there are many efforts underway. Look at the Ukraine conflict, for example. The Secretary General led an important effort on the Black Sea grain deal, which really provided a lot of important relief for a while. Unfortunately, that was discontinued. But there are lots of efforts, lots of challenges, no doubt about that. Let's also, though, not forget that much of what the UN does, it's peace and development, two sides of the same coin, as Dr. Jaishankar had pointed out. So much of what the UN does is around the development and humanitarian side of things and human rights as well. We can't forget the UN is helping to provide shelter and food and security and safety nets for something like over 120 million people in the world who've had to flee their homes from conflict and persecution. The UN is helping to vaccinate something like 40% of the world's vulnerable children from disease and preventable mortality. So there are so many areas in which there's a lot of really important progress being made, and it can sometimes be easy to forget about that. And the risk is that we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, that blanket criticisms really are a bit too blunt, broad of a brush. So we need to work on the peace and security, absolutely. And again, that's where I think India's voice is vitally important in this. India's coming forward with very constructive solutions. And we, in the UN institution, want that reform on peace and security to happen as quickly as possible.
Shombi, 1945, the United Nations, of course, was set up. In the next 80 years, where do you see the United Nations standing in a perfect world?
Well, I think, first of all, let's, again, because of this geopolitical churn, what's happening now and some moving away from this global commons, from working together, let us not forget precisely the lessons of the past, why we have the UN, why we have multilateralism. I personally am quite concerned. A lot of what we see happening today, barriers going up and things, looks pretty familiar. Almost sort of, we've seen this movie before, the interwar years, and then that led, First World War, Second World War, that led to this disastrous point at which the world came together and said, we need a UN. We need a place where we can come together for dialogue and diplomacy. Doesn't mean it always works by any means, but it means doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It's incredibly valuable, as Dr. Jaishankar said, as others in the past have said. Madeleine Albright said, if we didn't have a UN, we would need to invent it. So I think, the lesson is let's not repeat those mistakes. Let's invest in reforming the institution, because it does need to be reformed, so that it reflects the world as it is today. Again, much has changed in the last 80 years. So I believe, I hope that reform, for example, the Security Council and other aspects of the UN will move forward. There's a lot of effort in that regard, a lot of processes underway, and I think it will happen in the very near future. But the point is that it also needs to reflect today's reality is much more complicated. There's much more of a role in terms of the private sector, business, to drive the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 2/3 of the targets are off track, actually. So we're quite behind in that regard. But we realize, actually, who's going to provide decent jobs and work for the young people? And India, has the greatest youth generation in history. More young minds to tap for solutions than any country's ever had before. They need jobs. They need opportunities. Who's going to provide those jobs? In this day and age, it's the private sector, it's business. Who's going to bring the investment for energy transition, for climate action, these sorts of things? Government sets the guardrails, provides the incentives, but it's private sector that's really doing the heavy lifting. So I think that's where, in India, we see a lot of really exciting work and collaboration with the dynamic private sector, all kinds of things happening. So, there are many different players, and the UN, of tomorrow, actually the UN of today, needs to reflect that, and is very much so increasingly.
Shombi Sharp, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, and let me just conclude. I like to say, SDGs dunya mein mumkin hongi, kyunki India mein mumkin hongi. So I think SDGs are going to be achieved because they will be in India.
Well, there we go. Far better Hindi than me. That is all we have time for.